The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
Prices are really high at the minute. So last week we saw an average deadweight steer price of 5.90 pence per kilo, which is a record high for the GB market. And we're seeing a bit of a recovery on the demand side as well. So that's helping to drive those prices upward.
Bonkers beef prices, how high will they go? And how Britain's banks say they're backing Britain's farmers.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
Welcome to the Farmers Weekly Podcast. I'm Johann.
I'm Louise Impey.
And I'm Hugh Broom.
More on banks and beef prices later, but first, what exactly is farmland for? Food production, nature restoration, and renewable energy. Well, all those things and more, of course, but how much of each and where? Well, a government consultation aims to answer that very question by creating a long-awaited national land use framework. It suggests that 9% of England's farmland will have to be taken out of production and put into environmental measures by 2050 if we're to meet our net zero and nature restoration targets. Environment Secretary Steve Reed says he wants to protect our most productive agricultural land and boost Britain's food security. NFU President Tom Bradshaw says a food production target is vital.
Look, there's obviously hugely competing demands for land use. So, our absolute focus is on food production. We then hear about energy production, biodiversity net gain, net zero. This puts such stress on that available land resource. And we would like to see a food production target contained within the land use framework, because we obviously have those legislated environmental targets at the moment, the legislated net zero target. But if there's not a food production target, then the poor relation is always food production. And the challenge we're going to face is that very often we'll be importing that food from overseas when it's not produced in the same way with the same restrictions around it. And so that's no net improvement to the global biodiversity or climate change. It's really penalising UK farmers, and we'll live in a green and pleasant island, but we won't deliver the changes that are needed globally.
And in essence, how useful do you think this land use framework will be for farming?
I really hope it's based on science and evidence, because we haven't really had that confidence in recent years that the policy, we haven't seen the details sitting behind the policies. I welcome the fact we have a consultation coming, because again, we've been too critical. That we haven't had those consultations around policy, and suddenly we've had this iterative process, which sort of has been an excuse for getting it a bit wrong and then changing it. So I hope it's underpinned by science and evidence. We want members to really get involved with this, because this is going to have a lifetime way beyond this government. So it's really important that they engage and that we set the future that we need. And a lot of these legislated targets are already set in stone by previous administrations. We've never known how they're going to be delivered. And now I guess that we're going to start to see exactly what these changes mean.
That's National Farmers Union President Tom Bradshaw talking to Farmers Weekly's Phil Case. Louise, Hugh, this National Land Use Framework consultation, a long time coming.
It's been a really long time coming. 2021, I think it was, when Henry Dimbleby was asked by the then Johnson government to do the food and farming sort of State of the Nation report, which actually is a really good report. And I remember at the time we utterly took it apart on the podcast, and actually there's some really good stuff in there. And one of the chapters was about exactly this, having a land use framework. What that said is that you basically split land into three levels. So very productive, stuff in the middle, and then effectively conservation grade stuff. And then you concentrate whether you're doing biodiversity or you're doing food production accordingly, and then factor then all the other stuff you've got to do with land, whether it's about energy or building or infrastructure or water or flooding, and on it goes. So that's the whole idea, is that you have a rough framework of what goes where.
And as a country, we do have targets on biodiversity, targets for planning, no proper targets for food production, though. Can we expect to see some of those in the future? That's what farm leaders are wanting.
Absolutely. And as you heard in the audio there, Tom Bradshaw saying exactly that. And Tom is dead right, isn't he? There is a legal thing around biodiversity in the Environment Act. There's a legal thing about environmental protection. If it's around water and air, those are, if you will, two legs of the milking stool. And the third leg here is food production. There is no legal requirement around that at all. There's that sort of look that government has to do at self-sufficiency. I think that was a Johnson thing as well, wasn't it? But it's not legally binding. But if you're going to have these statutory designations, this land will only be used for growing bracken, or this land will only be used for flood relief or butterflies or whatever, then surely you need to back that up with something that sits around food production as well.
And Louise, you've been at a Fenland Soil Conference this week where exactly that issue was a topic of conversation. We ask so much from our farmland. It's under so much pressure from different things, be it water storage, the environment, biodiversity, food production. Where do we stand? Where do we go?
Yeah, that's right, absolutely. And I mean, the Fens has got really quite a unique challenge, if you like, on its hands, because it's a very fragile, vulnerable environment, vulnerable to climate change and sea level rise. It also, of course, is home to some of the most productive land in this country, and something like a third of all the vegetables that we consume in this country are grown in the Fens. So it's a very productive area, but it also has issues around carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and obviously it's got to get this balance between food security, climate, and the environment. So it's a really good example, if you like, of where the land use framework could help, because the general feeling there is that there has to be a mosaic of options that are used. It's made even more complicated by the fact that all peat is not the same. So they are on these lowland peat soils, some of which are still very deep, and they're really quite important. Some of them are what they call wasted peat or skirt soils, where that's already been degraded quite a lot, simply because the Fens were drained all centuries ago. So they've got to get this balance right there. And actually, they do produce a bit of everything. They do produce energy. They do produce food. They obviously have to look after water quality. They have to look after biodiversity and the environment, but lots and lots of conflicting pressures. So it's a really good example of where a land use framework, where it's got to be correct, actually.
And how do we know it's going to be correct, Hugh? I mean, Steve Reed, Defra Secretary Steve Reed, sort of announcing this consultation and then saying the government is not going to tell people what to do. I mean, if the government isn't going to show any leadership on this and tell people what it wants, and what's the point?
Well, yeah, exactly. And he says, in the quote, this framework will not tell people what to do. So it's not going to be some Stalinist war rag committee type dictatorate that tells you what you should farm where. I suppose the only thing you can possibly transpose out of this is based on the fact that, could the reason that all of the grant funding was pulled before Christmas, despite the fact they may have run out of money because it's been so oversubscribed, but it could also be that the way that they lure people down the land use designation path is by saying, if you're in so-and-so area, a very productive area, then grants to do with being very productive are available to you. And if you're in a conservation area, then grants to do with conservation are available to you. I don't know. It's quite a divisive thing. Even that's quite divisive based on the sort of universal approach that we've had up until now. And one key thing here, Louise hit on it when she's talking about the Fenland ecosystem and the peat soils and all that goes on there. This idea of mosaic. The reality is here, if we are to deliver, and I said this till I'm blue in the face, if we are to deliver what we have to deliver, whether it's around food production, biodiversity, habitat, flood protection, etc., etc., etc. We have to, the farming bits, we have actually got to do them really productively. Because if we do the farming bits really productively, it's land sparing and land sharing, isn't it? If we do the farming really productively, then it gives us the space to do the bits around the edges and have the corridors through the middle. And it's actually having those corridors and that interconnectivity, which is what will nail it in terms of biodiversity, in terms of habitat, as opposed to having these great, as we've said before, great chunks of stuff just doing one thing. 10,000 hectares of rewilding, not linked to anything else, is fine to a degree, but actually to get that mosaic effect and to get the bang for your buck, you need this interactivity. But to get people to do that, there's only one way they're going to do it and get on board, and it's about cash and it's about incentive and how you incentivize all of the people in this game to play in the same direction. And that is the big challenge that government has, isn't it?
I think there's another challenge, Hugh, actually. I think it's got to be evidence-based, because one of the really interesting things that has come out from the Fenland Soils project is that they were told originally that 40% of all of Cambridgeshire's emissions came from the farming on the peat soils. So they were given this huge figure. I think they were told that their emissions were 27 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents per hectare per year on that land. Well, what they actually have done is formed a group, and there's researchers and everybody involved in this, and they've gone out and measured that for themselves. And do you know, they have found that figure and those original figures were incorrect. And
Not
they have actually measured the emissions from these soils when they're cropped, and they're actually quite a bit lower. So that's been a really important finding. So, a land use framework, it's got to be evidence-based, because otherwise we're going to end up with these targets and these figures, which have been, if you like, plucked from the air, and nobody actually knows where they did come from originally. So I think that's a really important point. So that's maybe behind why he's saying we're not going to tell you what to do and where to do it. I think, the Defra view on it at this conference seemed to be this is going to be all about how we can make the most of our diverse landscapes.
Well, exactly, Louise. I mean, Steve Reed insisting that he's not going to tell us what to do, and yet the document itself insisting that about 9% of farmland is going to have to be converted into forest or wildlife habitat if we're going to meet our net zero and nature restoration targets by 2050. I mean, that says something else. And then what do we glean too from the venue where he made this announcement? The Royal Geographical Society in London at Kensington Gore is more about the environment than it is about food production agriculture, for example, Hugh.
The wonderful National Geographic Society in all its Edwardian arts and crafts fineness. It is. Yeah, you think that the other thing as well we might be able to glean something from, although I could be accused of being a cynical old git farmer here, is just looking at the press release, which I have so far. It has all the government type quotes from the Energy Secretary, the Deputy Prime Minister, obviously Secretary Steve Reed himself, and then there's a whole other plethora of quotes. The closest probably you get to farming is Sue Pritchard, Chief Executive of the lobby group Food and Farming Countryside Commission. And then everyone else in there is, you've got someone from the Green Alliance, Forestry Commission, Natural England, Environment Agency, Wildlife and Countryside Link, Wildlife Trust. Yeah, not much farming in there, which is, I don't know, if I was being the closest possible you get to farming than the other one is Tim Hopkin, who runs the Land app. And that's, so it could be that is it coming from a land manager? Is this designed to appease the environmental lobbies? Like I say, it's back to this whole thing around if you're going to zone stuff up, if you're going to try and create this mosaic of different uses, of different interdependencies, you have got to incentivize accordingly. It also ties in as well, and there's mention around the local nature recovery strategies, the LNRSs, which have all been sat on ice for years, and people have been trying to plan them. But again, there is no linkage to any incentive to actually get on and do it, other than wildlife trusts and other local conservation groups feeling good about themselves planning these things. But all the land managers that actually have to make a living out of it are saying, well, where's the incentive for us? So could this be the bit of policy that ties the grant funding to the LRSs, that incentivise the land managers to do things around that? And hopefully they're able to still farm and produce food alongside it. Look, the bottom line is everyone that's involved in managing land needs to use this consultation, because this is once in a certainly one, possibly two generation opportunity. If this does get laid down, you've absolutely got to make your voice heard here.
Yeah, do make your voice heard. Do take a look at that consultation. We'll put a link to the consultation document in the show notes page of this episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast, so you can respond yourself.
The Farmers Weekly podcast.
You're listening to the Farmers Weekly podcast. Welcome along wherever you're listening to us from. You can email us at podcast@fwi.co.uk. And if you're in the UK itself, you can also message us by texting the word farm, followed by your message to 88440. Now, as you heard at the top of the podcast, bonkers beef prices have reached something of a record high. Good news for beef finishers, although less so for beef store buyers. David Swales of the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board.
Yeah, bonkers is a nice way of putting it. I think at the minute the market's really strong. So last week we saw an average deadweight steer price of 5.90 pence per kilo, which is a record high for the GB market. And prices have been really high, I think, for the last year or so. So, John, if we compare that 5.90 with about a year ago, we were about 4.90. So, John, prices really have been building very solidly. So, Joe, great news if you've got cattle to sell. Maybe less good news if you're buying store cattle at the minute, because some of those prices will be feeding through to store values and presenting challenges. But yeah, what we're seeing is, I think, a bit of pressure in the market in terms of a bit of a shortage of supplies, and certainly a shortage of supplies which we expect to build over the next year and beyond. And we're seeing a bit of a recovery on the demand side as well. So that's helping to drive those prices upward.
Good to always do a story. I know you mentioned store cattle, but generally speaking, good to do a story that's positive for any farming sector at the moment. So good news for beef. I mean, I can go into a supermarket and the prices that you're telling me, I can get a steak for, not much more than the deadweight price.
Yeah, well, what we're certainly seeing is the prices farmers are getting have rapidly increased in the marketplace. So that's happened. And typically, retail prices are slower to change. So, sometimes we get calls from farmers where they see, prices going up in retail and their price isn't going up, and vice versa. So actually, at the minute, it's kind of a bit of good news, I think, for farmers. So the farm gate price has gone up quite rapidly, and the price shoppers are paying hasn't gone up as quickly. So, John, if I look at the average price for beef in retail at the minute, it's around about £10 a kilo, and it's gone up probably by about 4% in the last year. And that compares to, a growth of over 20% in farm gate prices. So the retailers, I think, are sort of absorbing some of those price increases, and probably processors as well are probably having to absorb some of those price increases. But that won't happen forever. I think at some point, those price changes will have to be passed on. Because the supply chain can't afford to continually absorb that level of increase.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, retailers and probably processors feeling some pain at the moment, but where do you see it going for farmers, for instance?
Well, for farmers, this is the perfect time for me to be talking to you about this, because we're literally about to publish our beef market outlook. So back end of next week, our beef market outlook will be published. And in that publication, we look at exactly these things. We look at how supply is expected to change over the next year and how demand is expected to change. So I can't give you the exact numbers today, but certainly what we'll be saying is that we expect the supply situation domestically to tighten. So, John, we've been projecting probably a fall of around about 5 to 6% up till now in domestic supplies next year. So that market will tighten up a little bit. And we expect the demand side domestically to continue to improve. So we're expecting a bit of a modest growth, only maybe 1% growth in domestic demand. But you can see, given those two things are changing, the situation we're in, there's potentially some measures there which will help support prices going into next year. And if we look at the global market as well, there's also some factors at work in the global market, in sort of places like the US and Brazil, where we expect supplies to tighten. So there are some things in the market which suggest the situation we're in now and the high prices could well continue into 2025.
So as a consumer, I ought to get down the local butcher or to the supermarket and buy some steak and stick it in the freezer.
Well, there's never a bad time, I think, to pop to the supermarket or to the butcher and buy steak. So I wouldn't argue against that. And yeah, certainly my expectation would be that some of those prices do rise during this coming year.
David Swales of the AHDB. Hugh, some good news for beef producers such as yourself.
Yeah, it's been a good news story for the last, year and a half or so. The prices have been edging ever upwards, haven't they? This week, we've seen it sort of break through the sort of R4L quoted UK price, HDB price, broke through the £6 barrier. Some prices have been quoted as that before this week, but it's been getting very close. And look, cattle are tight. That's just the bottom line of it. People, for whatever reason, there's lots of things going on, isn't there? There is lots of things going on here in the UK in terms of cattle numbers are tight. The suckler herd has contracted. It's dropped back under the 800,000, the herd size nationally over the last year or so. I think probably the changes in support have caused a lot of that, where people are actually looking at their business and going, I'm not getting the, basic payment every year, flat rate coming through the door. It's all about doing other stuff, and I don't really want to get involved with that. And actually, I'm just going to walk away. And a lot of people have done that. We've seen that for the last 5 or 6 years. You speak to any auctioneers around the country, and they'll tell you that spring suckler sales and autumn suckler sales, the stores are contracting. Those numbers contracting by 5-10%. all over the country. So that's happening. And then globally, the US beef inventories are lowest they've ever been, since just after the war. Even some of South America, they're pretty steady at. And consumption, on the flip side, consumption's going up. I mean, it was a bumper red meat Christmas. The Kantar figures for the UK for December showed about 3 or 4% rise in red meat sales around Christmas time, which is phenomenal. So people are tuning into protein, have woken up to what a fantastic product beef is, just as supplies are getting tight.
And supermarkets and processors, from what David Swales was saying, are absorbing this cost, but he feels that they're not going to be able to continue doing that forever. They are eventually going to have to pass that those price rises, those dead weight prices on to shoppers and consumers. Louise, are you eating much steak in your household at the moment?
Well, it sounds as though we better hurry up and get down to the shops and buy some, because at some stage the supermarkets aren't going to want to keep on carrying that extra cost, are they? But well, it's really good news. Of course, I think you did mention it. There is this real fashion, if you like, at the moment for protein, and a lot of people saying, you need to eat much higher protein diets now, whether that's red meat or eggs. I'm sure the demand is being driven quite strongly by that. And we all know that these nutrition fashions, they come and go, but it's certainly one I think that will probably be playing into the beef situation at the moment. It's nice to think that we can all go and stock up on beef while it's at the right price for us. And it's unusual, isn't it?
It certainly is unusual. Unusual too to have what is essentially, I guess, a good news story for farming in general.
Oh, yes, I know. Wouldn't that be really lovely, wouldn't it, if we could see the arable markets react in a similar way? So
they've had some high prices. It's beef's turn to get in there. We had low prices on beef while feed prices went through the roof. I know that everyone was suffered from fertiliser and fuel and everything else, tractor inflation as well. But it is good. And actually, I suppose, look, if you're producing beef and you're doing it efficiently, you're doing it well, there should be some margin there now. And it's like, mend the roof while the sun shines, sort out stuff, if there's stuff that could make it even more efficient or do whatever, I suppose that's the time to do it. Enjoy the fact that there's some high prices there. The worry is, though, is how hard can this battle of the lairages, because that's effectively what this is. This is factories outbidding each other to fill lairages day to day, to keep those factories viable, to keep those factories running. There's enough challenges in the small and medium-sized abattoir sector, but there are actually challenges. You speak to large factory operators and they'll tell you that their operating throughputs have dropped as cattle numbers have tightened. And that has an impact on those huge businesses. They may be turning over hundreds of millions of pounds, but it's still a big deal. So how long can the battle of the lairages continue? People trying to fill up factories to keep their volumes up. And where is that cash going to come from? And as you said, it could be that it gets passed on to the consumer at some point. And the worry is that it sort of, overheats. We're seeing overheating, for example, and we have seen for a while now, actually, in the store prices. The prices that finishers might have to pay for 100-day cattle and stuff like that. And that's really putting finishers off, because that's probably adding to the fire as well. Finishers are standing away and thinking, I am not paying crazy bucks for store cattle when I have no idea what the price is going to be in 100, 150 days' time, and no one's standing on those prices or giving me a guaranteed price. And you can understand why they want to get out of the fire a bit, because that's really risky. With some of the store prices are just on fire as well at the moment. In fact, more so than the actual finished prices. Some crazy prices being quoted at markets around the country. So let's hope it stays good, it stays up there, but it just needs to find that equilibrium, doesn't it? But with the cattle supply numbers where they are in the short term, that's possibly might not happen.
It might not happen very much at the moment, though. Up horn, not quite down corn. Yes, arable values could be better. By how much? Let's find out. This week's market prices. Hugh.
Well, the finished steer deadweight, as we were saying, the R4L price this week, 601.6, up from 586 last week. The finished steer all deadweight is 590. Unbelievable prices there. Live weight steer is 329.1. That is up 9p, nearly 10p on the week. Sheep prices, not to be sniffed at, are they? 738 is the SQQ on the deadweight. Live weight 325. That's 738. It's actually slightly back on last week where it was 741. Spare a thought though, whilst all you red meat people are out there celebrating, the pig market's not so hot. That's dropped back. If you look at the cull sow live weight, that's gone back to 49.1 pence per kilo, back from 58.8. And then the SPP, the GB average deadweight of pigs, that stands on at 204.2. It's changed marginally on the week. Arable markets, certainly not as hot as the red meat markets, as we said. Feed wheat 176.3. That's dropped back about £1 on the week. Milling wheat 207.3. That is back £2 exactly on the week. Feed barley, good if you're feeding those cattle. That's come back £2, 155.40. Oilseed rape 413.90. That's back £20 on the week. Feed peas, also back. That must be something happening if they drop back. 211.7. That's back from £232.30 last week. Feed beans, 212. That actually stands on £212.10 per tonne. For the red diesel price, marginally okayish news there. It's marginally crept up. Average ring round red diesel price this week is 72.9 pence per litre.
The Farmers Weekly Podcast.
We've heard a lot in recent weeks about supermarkets backing Britain's farmers against the government in the battle over inheritance tax. But what about Britain's banks? Farmers are big borrowers, with lending from banks accounting for about £15 billion of agricultural liabilities. With farmers now facing 20% inheritance tax, are the banks worried about their ability to repay that debt? Brian Richardson of Virgin Money.
Yeah, we've been working closely with our customers, understanding the challenges that it will present for our customers. And we're, I think, very focused that this and other challenges that the industry is seeing, that we see government working closely with farmers' leaders to try and find a way forward for this. It's very important the industry has a clear view going forward, and it perhaps matches the ambitions that government says it has in terms of food security and seeing a prosperous farming industry, but plenty of challenges at the moment.
We've seen supermarkets like Morrison's, for example, telling farmers opposing the inheritance tax, we're with you. Is that something that you're saying?
I think, government's got lots of challenges we're all aware of in terms of paying the bills, making sure we've got a health service that works. It needs to raise some money. I think it's put forward areas it wants to look at, including inheritance tax. And we're very keen that government talks closely with the industry to look at the consequences of that and works through the challenges there. And I think we are seeing some of that, certainly with Defra at the moment.
Would you like to see a sort of that conversation on a more formal basis, something like a consultation, or do you think it's more a case of an ongoing dialogue?
Well, I think theoretically the budget is proposals are put forward in the budget and then they're consulted on and put into legislation. So let's hope that there's chance as that legislation grows that the views of farmers' leaders are taken into account on that. But I think it's broader than that at the moment. It's about the whole direction of agriculture, where support comes from. So yes, the immediate challenge of agricultural property relief and IHT. We've got a support regime that would perhaps question, is it working as well as everyone intended it to? And is that going to provide a secure base going forward? And more importantly, does it have long-term funding attached to it? Future environmental needs around net zero. What are farmers going to be required to do there? And then the whole debate around food security. So I think there's a large number of issues that need to be brought together, really. And it's all right talking about the 25-year plan looking forward, but I think farmers would like to know what they're doing in the next 3 to 5 years, really.
And in terms of that, I mean, you Virgin Money's got a considerable, I believe, about $1.5 billion lent to farmers or lent to the sector. How worried are you that the assets that money is borrowed against are now going to be liable potentially to a 20% inheritance tax from April 2026?
Well, I think ourselves, and I'm sure the other banks have looked at their lending book. And does this cause us any immediate challenges? I don't think it does. We obviously talk with valuers, etc. So that underlying asset that secures a lot of the lending we actually do, we feel is okay. We certainly haven't changed any of our lending policies. We have an appetite to lend into the sector, and we've been very supportive of the sector and been very publicly supportive of the sector in terms of pushing forward that investment. I think farmers generally have really since COVID stood back a little bit from investment. Some of it's been, well, what do I actually invest in? What does the future look like? Some of it has just been the challenge of inflation, etc. So farm borrowing overall has come back from where it was in 2020. We don't feel that there's any immediate challenge there. We work with all our customers, and indeed, we're very involved with a lot of events around the country where we're supporting farmers talking about succession and that forward planning.
And in terms of investment, then, I mean, some farmers are saying, well, we do face this uncertainty. We are putting investments on hold, be it infrastructure or capital investment, etc. You're saying that you are open for business. The long-term prospects for the industry are good. What would your advice to farmers be?
Every case is different, and we had shortly after the budget, we had an event at the Three Counties Showground where we had over 100 farmers there, and yes, a lot of the talk around was inheritance tax, but I think they're all looking at, well, how am I going to future-proof my business? What do I need to do? Yes, I've got the immediate challenge of working through inheritance and the consequences for my business and succession in my business, but what can I be investing in? What is the picture going to look like for agriculture in 3 to 5 years? What's happening with support arrangements? So clarity around that is important. But I think fundamentally, the UK has a really, really good agricultural business that is capable of adapting, is resilient. And we see, and I see certainly traveling around the country and visiting farms, a lot of really successful businesses that are doing really well. They want to invest in the future. They want to invest in that next generation as well. So it is difficult, and I think post-Brexit it has been difficult just understanding what the direction of travel will be. And that would be my ask, really. We understand what that direction is. We understand what's required of the farming industry, and then farmers can get round and plan for it. But as a bank, and I believe the other banks as well, we are very supportive of the sector. It is, well serviced. All the banks, and we particularly focus, and I spend all my time doing it, on supporting farmers. And it's a long-term business, and we recognise it as that.
Brian Richardson, thank you very much. So, Louise, Brian Richardson there from Virgin Money, a very nuanced stance, I think it's fair to say, when it comes to the issue of inheritance tax, talking about the need for dialogue between the government and farmers, and for farmers to feel supported.
Yes, he was he was a bit vague on some of that, I felt. I mean, I understand why. I think most of the banks, Brian's included, would say that they are working very closely with their farming clients all of the time, and that they're supporting them and that they're helping them to be, economically and environmentally resilient. But the question I think that you were asking was whether they might go a bit further and actually speak to the government on farming's behalf and explain the situation and the difficulties that have arisen since that announcement. And he didn't really say that, did he? Look, it's quite difficult, but there is going to be a big need for the banks and their understanding of agriculture in the coming year. We know that. I mean, some of this debt serviceability is going to be quite tricky, I think. So, yeah, maybe we need to get to see more of some of these banks come out and support the farming industry at this difficult time.
What's your take on it, Hugh? I mean, Brian was sort of saying that this is another challenge, another change that farming needs to get to grips with.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. Well, we know it's a big challenge potentially. I suppose the one reason, it's a bit like when Brexit happened. I remember a friend of mine saying that at the Royal Highland Show, when the Brexit vote was announced back in 2016, that fateful morning in June, and all of a sudden, apparently all the bank people fled for wherever they went to get on their phones to talk to their big honcho bosses and to reassure them that just because we were leaving the EU, the security book that is UK farmland and farm assets wasn't in peril. What's this probably, if this tax regime as proposed was to progress further forward, you could possibly argue that the value of that security, of those securities, could be more imperiled and as a result of Brexit. So it might be why banks may want to get involved. And farmers, first and foremost, are taking more and more risk. Like everything, we've just been talking about crazy inflated beef prices. We had it when we had crazy inflated arable prices. It seems that all the time now, we are just having to gamble more and more and more value to achieve the same, if not less and less, or no margin at all. And it's becoming more and more of a perilous walk. So when things like that tax policy comes along and makes it even more perilous because it could write the value down of your securities against your borrowings, that's really worrying, isn't it? So, yeah, fair play to Brian getting involved. Let's hope the others get involved. And they may well have been. They may have been in quietly, had a quiet word in the Chancellor's ear and said, do you realise what you've just done to our securities with the idea of this tax policy going ahead? But it is, it's another pressure, absolutely.
Another pressure, another concern to worry about. Louise, returning to the Fenland Soil Conference that you were at this week, one of the speakers there was Lloyds Banking Group Head of Agriculture, Ben Maciejewski. He also addressed this issue of land values, of asset values.
Well, that was a question, actually, that he was asked by a member of the audience. And he actually said that security values are not such a concern at the moment. The thing that they are more worried about is debt serviceability, which, if you think about it, is not very surprising because it's the cash flow, isn't it, for this coming year that's really been hit. The effect of any tax changes on land values is probably not going to come into force for a little while. But it's this debt, size of this debt, and whether farms can cope with that this year. That's their bigger concern.
Cash flows tight on many farms in 2025, as we know. Ben Maciejewski also addressing that in the form of Lloyds Bank helping farmers generate income from carbon, Louise.
He was actually talking about a new insetting scheme, exchange market, which they've gone into as part of their partnership with the Soil Association Exchange. And what they've done here is they are going to reward farmers for improving their carbon balance. So they've come up with a £1 million fund to begin with. And involved in this fund with them is Tesco, Lidl, Co-op, the church commissioners, and then also one other global food processor. I'm not quite sure who that is yet. He wasn't able to say. But anyway, together they are going to be paying farmers for carbon reductions. And they're starting with the arable supply chain because apparently that's the least transparent. So farmers they put in their action plan, show what they're prepared to do, what practices they're going to change. They get a 50% payment up front, and then they get the rest of it at the end of the year. So it's a 1-year contract. And it's £60 per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent reduced. Yeah, so it's a payment worth having. It is going to tempt some people. I think there's a lot of monitoring and measuring done in this Soil Association Exchange scheme. So that's what he was talking about. Initially, there are just 100 farmers can be involved, but they're very keen to get this up and running and see, what it can do and how it can help farmers. So it's about measuring, improving, and rewarding.
An unusual news week then, Hugh. Beef prices up, supermarkets helping farmers, and banks helping farmers too.
Yeah, exactly. It's bizarre, isn't it? But hey, bear in mind the reason why banks are helping farmers is because they need the data. It's all to do with emissions. It's all to do with Scope 3. They need to be able to say to the people that they borrow or take the big chunks of money that they then lend to farmers and that funds the supply chain, that this is all going to the right farms with the right credentials, which, it's the market in action, effectively. It's pushing people in the right direction in terms of getting on top of their emissions. But when you're given a free consultant comes up the drive and you're getting a free emissions profile of your business, that is the reason why they need to be able to go back to those markets. The people putting money into those investment funds want to know where it's going. They want to know that if they're investing on behalf of their investors, be they pension holders or whoever, that it's going into the right place with the right green credentials. And that's why it's happening. But if it means that it improves performance and it improves emissions efficiency on farm, all because of it, then that's all good, isn't it? It's all moving in the right direction, assuming that it's also improving and making the actual production of food more efficient at the same time.
Well, thank you, Hugh. Efficient food production, that's what it's all about. Thank you to Louise. That's it for this episode of the Farmers Weekly podcast. As we always say, do remember, you can email us, podcast@fwi.co.uk. We'd love to hear your views on any of the stories that we've talked about, and indeed stories that we haven't talked about. If there's something out there that you think we should be covering, do get in touch. You can also, if you're in the UK, message us by texting the word farm followed by your message to 88440. For now, though, do subscribe to the Farmers Weekly podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really like what you hear, do leave us a 5-star review. But for now, until next week, I'm Johann.
I'm Louise Impey.
And I'm Hugh Broom.
Thank you for listening.